Osio Nagata, welcome to another episode of Frontlines Are Everywhere, the podcast that really looks at Indigenous internationalisms and the ways we express our self-determining authority across Turtle Island and throughout the world. So my name is Jeff Corntassel. I'm from Cherokee Nation, and I'm so pleased to have our two guests today, Morgan and Raven. And so I'm going to read short bios for you both and then have you introduce yourselves. So thank you for being part of this. Xwesultun, Raven Borsey, is from Lummi Nation and a graduate student in cultural anthropology at Western Washington University. He's a young tribal leader and research fellow with the Setting Sun Institute. His work with Setting Sun Institute includes helping to publish Reef Netters of the Salish Sea, which is the final thesis of the world-renowned anthropologist Wayne Settle. So thank you, Raven. And Morgan Brown is a Tsimshian mother who empowers Indigenous youth through traditional plant medicine, first foods, and language revitalization. Her work includes cultivating educational ethnobotanical garden, revitalizing ancestral trade patterns, and healing generational trauma with teachings rooted in kinship and stewardship. So, thank you both for being here, and I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourselves.
Hi, Jeff. Xwesultun sanesna chach walamisen I chach wiwakai I squile talno. Good day, everyone. My name is Raven Borsey. My traditional name is Xwesultun, and I am from the Lummi Nation and descendant of Webukai First Nations. Thank you for having me here.
Xwesultun, Jeff. Morgan Brown de Wayu, Simsienu, Lugo Lailtkanu, Nuyu Gwa'a. My name is Morgan Brown, and I am Tsimshian, and I feel very fortunate to be here today. It's an honor to do this work and have these conversations together, and I'm grateful for you creating the space for this kind of stuff to happen.
Excellent. Wado, thank you. Yeah, I look forward to our conversation. First question is really kind of a question that we frame around the origin of this podcast, which is all about Indigenous internationalism. And we're kind of playing with that term. What does it mean? And it's going to mean something different to every Indigenous nation, right? Every community, maybe even every Indigenous person has a different concept of it. And so we think about our trade networks. We think about the ways that we engage in treaty making, even amongst ourselves, or even with plant nations, with animal nations. We think of our stories, our activism that transcends state borders. So I was wondering what you think about this term. What does Indigenous internationalism look like for you? You may have a totally different term that you use to describe it, or maybe a different concept. But what is this term? Does it resonate? Does it mean something to you?
I was actually going to... Morgan has a really good reference of natural boundaries, and I was going to ask her to open up. But for a quick hitch, Indigenous worldwide is really breaking down and understanding what those natural boundaries were pre-contact, not the boundaries that we see established today that come from an entirely different system. But what are those natural boundaries? And especially today, and one of the things I always push forward for Indigenous research or Indigenous sovereignty is that the sovereignty, the research, the work will be as diverse as the ethnic groups that you're working with. And so it's not a blanket term that you get to cover up and put over people. It will be a diverse process in different places of the world. And so I'll pass it over to Morgan.
Were you referring the bear in the language? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, this is one of my favorite studies that I've found where they studied the genetic mappings of grizzly bears in the territory encompassing like around the Great Bear Rainforest. Some of that I think goes into my ancestral territory as well as others. But they took the genetic map of the grizzly bears and then looked at the different language dialects as well. And those maps almost overlaid each other precisely. And for me, it's just like something in the scientific world, I guess the Western scientific world, that really validates this like deep knowing that I feel in myself, being connected as territory, and all of us are expression of territories. That's the way that I see it. And those territories, they hold different expressions within themselves, and they hold different forms of generosity and medicine, and what us as peoples, like humans, would consider land-based wealth. That really gives birth to our capacity to exchange these forms of land-based wealth with each other. And that is like where all of our, our grease trails, our trade networks, they were always connected back to our territory. And I think that's really important to go back all the way to the root, where we can also give ourselves the visibility of being land, because I don't know, what is this? This is land. We are land. And a lot of us, like for me, I am Tsimshian. I'm also Ukrainian. I have mixed ancestry, and even within my indigenous Tsimshian value system, I sit with all of my ancestors at that table. I think it's really important for us to do that. We can't just neglect or omit any piece of ourself, because we all are in this together. And that's the kind of relational restoration that the world really needs right now. And it has to start inside of us. And I just also, when we were introducing ourselves, I also wanted to introduce a lot of the plant relatives that we've brought into the space too. Raven has brought some relatives in the space, and then I have a basket of, these are my relatives, and all of them I also consider to be my teachers. And I think it's really important to remember to invite them into the conversation. So that's my intention of having them in this space here. And I encourage others to do that too.
Excellent. And that's such a powerful way of introducing these relatives, and some of which have traveled for hundreds of miles to get across that artificial colonial border. Can you talk a little bit about some of your relationships to these ancestors, these relatives? I
could do that for a very long time. Sure. I guess one that I will, I'll speak of the Devil's Club, which is, I don't know if you can see it. I don't really want to touch this part, but okay. Yeah, here it is. And for those that may not know Devil's Club, all the above ground parts are covered in very sharp spines that have little burrs on the end. And if you approach them without really taking the time to respect them, they will let that be known. And they will stay with you for a long time. And you'll have to spend time remembering that moment, And so that's an example of one of the teachings from, in my language, we say wumps. Being able to have healthy boundaries, being able to have self-protection, when you have medicine to offer the world, it's important to know how to protect your medicine as well, so that it is respected and it is honored. And that's something that I've learned a lot from this plant. And it's not only does it protect itself, but it protects water and it protects old forests. So, I look at how they show up, and they give me a bit of a compass or a map of like how I want to show up, So that's one example. I could go on. I could just talk and talk, but we'll stop.
Even, you're reminding us too, the Devil's Club, they have their own protocols. And if you violate those protocols, or if you approach it too quickly without permission, right, it reminds you, right? Exactly. And so that is such a powerful reminder.
Yeah. And just going back to the Indigenous internationalism, it's a bit tricky for my mind to fully grasp that in. The words that come to me is like systems of interdependence and land-based wealth that is inseparable from values of generosity and respect and reciprocity. And I'll share one more, which is the wolf moss, because this lichen right here is what really opened a big thing for me about understanding the systems of independence. And I feel like it's really the way that the earth wants to function is for our Xwesultun weaving, which is right here. Our yellow, traditionally, we use the wolf moss to make. I also have these earrings that my friend Larissa made, and she dyed the palms with the wolf moss and put the wolf moss in the little hearts too. But I found out through my curiosity that the wolf moss doesn't grow anywhere within our traditional territory. And I thought, why would we choose to have something that gives us like our sacred yellow color that doesn't grow in our territory? I was like, where would we have gotten that from? Like, what are these relationships? And that opened up my curiosity in my mind to really, like, I think because of how the environment I've grown up in, when I hear the word sovereignty even, it's like, well, each person, each community, each nation is self-sufficient. And, oh man, no, we were relation-based. We've always been relationship-based with each other, so I think that's kind of the internationalism, but it's really just having these relations and remembering we are expressions of the same territories as all of our other kin that exist within our territory, and we have a role to play within that kinship ecosystem. And for us as humans with our bodies, we get to be these exchangers of the wealth and the generosity between territories. And when I lean into just feeling that and imagining it, it feels like a system of self-love for Earth. Like, this is how Earth loves self. And that's every time I feel that, it just feels like medicine, even just imagining it. So I'm really grateful to this lichen for showing all of that to me. And it's also led me a lot into my work around seed rematriation and wanting to help breathe life back into our ancestral trade routes and all the relationships that come along with them. So
beautiful. Thank you for that. Raven?
Yeah, as Morgan speaks, I learn. And I really, I think as you engage more and more with different culture, like a whole new perspective. I really, there's a connected way of culture and there's a disconnected way of culture. And you look at these natural boundaries of the wolf moss, and you look at the natural boundaries of the salmon, and you look at the natural boundaries of just the different species that make up not just one culture, but several cultures. And together through these trade routes and through these cultures and these people living in these places have a responsibility to uphold the health and relationship with this place. And by trading that, you extend that relationship beyond its own natural borders. And what do you get? Well, you get this thriving economy that is rooted in inherent. It's an inherent economy, and it's rooted in the very earth, the waters, the lands, and therefore your entire culture comes from not only respecting your own culture, but it comes from respecting other people's culture and what that culture brings to you, bringing you the wolf moss, which becomes the sacred part of your tool. Or for us, in our territory in Lummi, we don't have mountain goats, but through the process of breeding, I believe coyotes, you look at a woolly dog, they look like a coyote. And through the process of trades and harvesting, people in the south who harvested mountain goat wool, blankets were a crucial part of survival. Without a blanket, you don't live. And specifically, white blankets were a symbol of status. And to have these beings far beyond the reaches of our natural territories being traded in, and then things from our territory being traded out, and just how to put our thumb on that today in modernity. How do you take an economy that's on the other side of the world and say, I have profound respect for everything that the economy stands for and the roots and what that economy can provide, vice versa. It becomes a relationship of gratitude, of reciprocity. When you need a stimulus check, you don't hand out dollar bills. Dollar bills can be hoarded and hung on to. But you hand out salmon, you hand out camas, you hand out all of these things, no matter how good you preserve them, have an expiration date. At some point, that salmon that was preserved for 3 months to a year will go bad. And you have to give it away. You have to invest it into the society. What happens when you take a stimulus check, instead of it being dollars, it's excess of food, and you put it out into the people who are all in your community. And you may have saved a whole family from starving in the winter. And then they come back wealthier. The whole community comes back stronger and wealthier with these additional resources to provide for the next season and provide for the community of people, but provide for the overarching community in the natural worlds. So thank you for sharing, Morgan.
Yeah.
Yeah, so much there. And I think of, in some ways, the notion of abundance is so different with Indigenous communities. We're not thinking about scarcity, we're thinking about generosity of spirit. We share what we have, and it's not just, we don't treat it as just unlimited resources, it's relationships that we have to nurture and protect.
What Raven was talking about, like, just reminds me of those underlying values, like, it's so important to be able to receive. And I think it requires being connected in our hearts and being vulnerable too. And can feel scary in the world to be in that kind of space. But that's how that whole system starts. Is I can speak for us up north. One of our biggest forms of wealth throughout time has been hooligan. And, it's not something we give ourselves. That's given from our territory, from them. They come, and it's incredibly generous. And there's so much love in the way that this world functions. And to remember, like, it starts with being able to feel that and let that in. Like, just start with getting in touch with that feeling. And you have to go out into these places. You have to be with them to understand, like, how much love there is, how much generosity there is, how they're also taking care of each other. It's not just everything for us. Those hooligans are feeding so many more beings just than us, and there's other ones that are feeding them, and being able to allow that feeling into the heart, and then from there, that's part of like the transmission of the teaching of generosity. Then you can carry that teaching as a living teaching and how you move forward. It's what inspires us to have reciprocity and respect. But it's like, if we're just telling ourselves, we have to do these things, like this is the right way to do it, without taking the time to have all that good feeling in the heart and let it in, it gets a lot harder to do. So receiving, I think, is a really big piece.
It's going to be done with feeling and not hoarding, right? As you said, Raven, we can't, the hoarding mentality leads to people going hungry. It leads to people not getting enough sustenance, and to whose benefit, right? To a very small percentage.
And I think like in a lot of indigenous community, in my language, we would say gweta, which means like poor, that mentality is actually considered poor. Somebody that holds true wealth, they would not be showing up that way. Mm-hmm. Only if you feel like you don't ever have enough, then you have to take more than you need.
And I know potlatches happen all over, and there's definitely places in the Coast Salish tribes where potlatches carry a different name, but the overall title is for the potlatches an English term, but that the actual practice, and in our region we do a potlatch after the salmon, usually in August. Traditionally, our salmon ceremonies here in the Salish Straits for the reef netters would have been in August, and it would have been in late August after the runs, maybe early July if it was the first salmon, or if you did a potlatch at the end of the salmon season, then you would do it in August. So depending on which families you came from, the salmon ceremony starts by you stop catching the salmon. As soon as you get the first bag of salmon in, all the fishing stops and it kicks off the salmon ceremony. And this ceremony can last up to 10 days, where there's going to be namings, there's distribution of wealth of the first catch, handing out protocols, different people, roles of coming of age ceremonies, going into fishing, going into camas stewarding, different roles for males and females. And then the fishing is stopped for 10 days while the prime run of sockeye continue their journey upriver without being caught. And then after that ceremony ends, then the gear enters the water, and there's a hole in the back of the net made out of willow ring. And while you're pulling in the bags of salmon on these runs, salmon are always escaping through the hole. And that ensures that you don't catch the first or the last salmon. But toward the end of the salmon, the overall fishing season, in August, they would do another potlatch. And some of these families that caught just an abundance of excess salmon would use that time to give away, and tribes would come as far as the Okanagan people over the Cascade Mountains to trade salmon and resources. And that's how far those marriage relationships extended. But it was the responsibility of the people who lived in the territory year round to cater and steward to that, to ensure that every year the salmon come back. And so you get this dispersion of different responsibilities from people who travel further out and those that are place-based. But then imagine if you have an excess of salmon and you give it away to this family, and then the next year you don't have an excess of salmon. Your family is left struggling to starve, but you can rely on those other families that you provided to in the past to come through and lift you up in your times of down. And you always have this level of credit that occurred naturally and organically. And it wasn't based off quantity. It wasn't based off a quantification, a direct number. It was just based off this good feeling, this good spirit of sharing that wealth. And so that's another. It's just so complex, this generosity of an inherent economy, and it's one of the many complex things in indigenous communities that we can go on and on and on about, because it's not learned from a people thing. We're not the first ones on these lands, and all of our cultures acknowledge that we came to these lands, and all of these plants and beings were on these lands, and they taught us how to live here, how to be here. And to say it's in harmony is like in English sense, it's to be a natural place of being. So, yeah.
Excellent. And it really kind of reminds me of how we have a different sense of time as Indigenous peoples, different sense of seasons, and it's guided by those inherent relationships, right, to place.
Totally. And we don't have many opportunities with the demands of just getting by in today's, the way that things are structured today, to really live in our reality of time. It's a struggle. And I feel very fortunate to, through doing language work, through coming back more deeply into relationship with my language, have forged really beautiful relationships. I think when we take the time to find each other through our language, through our songs, our dances, our foods, then it sets up those relationships for healing and restoration when that's how we come back. So in doing that, I was invited by a really amazing, beautiful family up north to my daughter and I were invited to come to their seaweed camp. And they are one of few families that has been continuously keeping this tradition alive. And there still is a traditional small longhouse out on the island. And for 3 weeks, we go out there and get to live in our reality of time. And this last year was my second year getting to be a part of this. And it has, when I went for the first time last year, it completely changed my view on everything. Myself as an educator, working with youth, and what I feel like is actually important for them to get to have access to and experience. Our children, I mean, all of us need to be able to exist in our reality of time. You know, right now it's like time for pulling cedar. Our reality of time is built on all of these relationships. It's built on listening and being a part of everything. It's being in relationship. It's not an imposition on everything that takes us out of the relationships. You know, its whole existence depends on all of it, just like our languages do. And they're, you know, when we're all under one roof together, there are teachings, there are things that are shared when we're out on the rocks. You know, those rocks, there's relationship with those rocks, like with that seaweed, and maintaining them, coming back to them. Like, we really need to do everything we can to keep our reality of time alive in today's world. That is one of the most important things that I could advocate for.
I love this term, reality of time. I really love playing with semantics in the English language, because it's hard to capture like what is meant in these philosophies. And a good thing that I would say is, if you give someone a watch, perfectly functioning watch, 365 days a year, the exact time, they will miss a salmon run every single year. And it's because that watch is very direct, and it makes you think that every year is flipped and every year is identical, and it's not. The natural time will tell you when things are ready. You show up a week early to harvest cedar. If you had a watch, you'd be struggling for a week trying to wait for the cedar to be ready to be harvested. Or would show up, and let's say there's a change in temperature, change of season, change in humidity, just anything that could occur once every so often, once every 4 years, and it causes these the phenomenons that happen in nature to occur on a different timing. And so your timing isn't based off this direct need to know the time 100% of the time. Your timing is based off this phenomenons, and when things are happening will tell you when other things are going to happen and occur. And you can tell if something, you can make predictions with the natural world that you wouldn't be able to make by staring at like this 100% accurate watch or calendar per se. And one of the things I'm cheering on Devil's Club if you guys are wondering what's going on. One of the things that's ironic is during this period of climate change, the climate shift, we're seeing cedar harvesters going out and making scientific observations that the cedars are either going into hibernation later on because it's not getting cold fast enough, or they're not coming, or they're coming out of hibernation too early, and then you get a cold spell that happens and it kills off parts of the trees like the branches and stuff, and that's it shows that even in today's sense that indigenous timing and reading phenomenons can give earlier hints than foundational science can with literal answers, which will take a couple of years to prove. And I believe it already has shown that when you need time to prove and validate things versus being on the land and actually witnessing them year after year after year, that one's going to be direct. One's going to be a direct receiver to what's happening, and the other one's going to be like, okay, now we found the problem a few years later. What are we going to do about it? And we started off a little too late. So yeah, natural timing.
Yeah, I love this conversation, and it's just reminds us of where our priorities need to be. And we were joking, I think, over lunch about having a salmon app, and we would still miss it, right? Because the Wi-Fi wasn't in line, or we couldn't afford the app, right? So these artificial notions of time just don't do it for us in terms of nurturing and I guess perpetuating those practices.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think thinking about the time too, there's a listening and being in relationship with everything around us, and then I'm remembering Raven's sharing of the Great Flood, and like the listening that gave the guidance, and it came from outside, but there was also a knowing that those canoes needed to be built, that food needed to be put up, and that came before those things were needed. We are taken care of in ways that don't have to be confined by the time that we are in here in this world. But we have to we have to take care of ourselves and be in touch with our instinct and our intuition. I think that's so important with what we're coming up on. Being able to be available within yourself to receive those messages, to receive that care and that love, and that protection. I believe that has allowed many of us to survive today, is by listening to that.
Yeah, and I think of it as the basis for our resilience. 10,000, 20,000 years of resilience, It's not happenstance or by accident. We know what we're doing. And we have that relationship, that direct relationship. I have a question that kind of expresses that a little bit. So the Buffalo Treaty was signed in 2014. It was with Blackfoot Nations and the Buffalo to really honor that sacred relationship. And the knowledge holders, the elders, they really decided that because there weren't any buffalo in their territory at that time, and the youth were singing buffalo songs, they were telling buffalo stories, but they weren't experiencing the buffalo, they said we need to do something to kind of remind youth and remind other people that this relationship is enduring and it's going to happen, right? It's going to be perpetuated through time. And so they signed this Buffalo Treaty. It was originally 8 Blackfoot nations. Now it's up to 50 different indigenous nations that have signed on. And it's a pretty cool treaty. There's all sorts of different things about education and healthcare. And it just got me thinking, that's such a clever way of getting youth involved and expressing those resilient kind of behaviors or those practices. Is there room for, something like a salmon treaty, a camas treaty? Is that helpful? I mean, I imagine, as a Cherokee, we have a story how medicine came to the people. It was really how we broke our treaty with the Deer Nation and how the plants came to our rescue. And so are those treaties helpful in your mind? Is that another way maybe of bringing youth or bringing folks into the conversation about the urgency of protecting salmon or protecting camas or any number of plants or animals?
I'll start off by speaking to salmon, and I'll let Morgan speak to camas, because I feel like camas is definitely less controversial in the sense of there's a lot of fish wars happening that have happened. It's not really tribes that need the treaty. I want to put emphasis on that, because tribes have done so much putting their treaties on the line and building a good relation. I will say this, yes, if the tribes come together and agree to a salmon treaty across the border especially, huge, profound. But then it's just more of the same thing, tribes doing the work, taking the progressive lead. What we need the placeholders. We need the Washington state fisheries, the federal fisheries, the fisheries in BC. We need those fisheries to work together, to share the data, to keep it pulling together. Maybe they already started the process, but to keep that science, that Western science, on the same page and up to par. You can't have different numbers reading just because there's an international boundary in the way, because you're playing with our relatives, and it's the process of overfishing is not indigenous people overfishing. It's the value system that was placed on all fishermen, indigenous, non-indigenous, and there just needs to be a treaty overall. And a prime example of this is 2 tribes. You have Xwesultun and you have Lummi. Lummi is suing Xwesultun right now because of the terminal expansion in Roberts Bank. Roberts Bank terminal expansion is predicted to hand our resident orcas, our relatives, the Xwesultun, the resident orca killer whales. It's predicted to hand them an extinction, and one will wonder, geez, I thought tribes were supposed to be helping the environment. Well, that's not our fault that we were kind of stereotyped under this umbrella. Some tribes like Lummi, who have worked hard to reject the coal terminal in 2016, it was the biggest coal terminal it would have been the biggest coal terminal in North America. We rejected it. We could have been billionaires. We could have had what Xwesultun or even Puyallup below us has had. Maybe they were forced into those positions where they had to sell out that territory, or someone else would have. But those are 100 level conversations. On a 500 level scale, at the end of the day, Lummi is still using our sovereignty as a reflection of what we signed in the treaties. And you get these other tribes that are not doing that. They whether they're forced to or not, objectively they sell out, and those ships come through our waters, and therefore they're not only selling out their sovereignty, they're selling out all of our sovereignty for their own benefit of their nations. And what are they forced into it by? What do they have to do it with? What are they competing with around them? The corporations, the other entities that are going to be exploiting those deep water ports. It's extremely unfortunate, but it is something that we need to address as a nation that has not reflected that colonial image, that has intentionally denied it and suffered economically because of it. How do we start pointing that out? How do we put a label on that and say that our individual sovereignty as Lummi, our individual sovereignty as indigenous people, mine and Morgan, we each are own sovereign beings within ourselves, just like everything that's in front of us has its own sovereign spirit. But how do we get back to that? And then when we're talking about a treaty, it's got to go beyond just tribes. We have to have this understanding that if these 2 tribes are going to sell out, that all of the tribes who share that resource and have that signing need to have a way to benefit for their losses. and then the state and federal governments, they need to be aware of this when they're also making these changes, adding more industry, bringing in more economic value, sending in more ships, because Roberts Bank was indefinite. It was going to happen. And that's, maybe it's related to COVID and sicknesses and more shipping routes, needing to send competing spaces for fossil fuels, shipping routes, and farming foods. But it's like, at what end? To what end do we keep this privilege going? And a salmon treaty is going to extend far beyond salmon. And so I hope that we can get to that level a lot sooner than later. And I also hope that we're not ignorant of how hard that process is going to be.
Well, for that. Yeah, and for giving us a nuanced view of this. This is not just as simple as saying we're going to go do a treaty. There's got to be a lot of consideration, especially around those municipalities and even the state governments and how they're going to support that. Thanks for that. We'll hear what you have to say, Morgan. We'll hear about the rejection of that expansion, and then we'll kind of go to the closing questions.
Yeah. My questions would be, who is it really for? What is it really for? When I think of a treaty, I think of paper. We've had, I don't know if we would call them treaties, but we've had in my language, we say ayaw. That's our laws. So if it gives our inherent ayaw the visibility that it needs in today's world, if it helps to protect that, but I don't think we should rely on this, that form. We have to go deeper than that and remember that we are born into a treaty already. We are born into kinship. We're born into this world with, it's already here, So we're not, in many ways, we're not abiding by our natural laws anymore. And it is really disheartening and sad when that level of imperialism and colonization comes between us as Indigenous peoples and Indigenous communities. It's so heartbreaking to see that happening. And I just want to know, how can we scoop each other all back in, We don't have time to be like that with each other. That does not belong to us. That is not our sickness. And we have to remember who we are, and we have to remember our ayal. And we have to be in these relationships to do that. We have to. There's nothing that can replace them. And our children won't even know to care for them if they don't know them.
Wonderful for that. And it reminds me of Frantz Fanon, talks about how in the latter stages of colonization we fight amongst ourselves. So how do we bring ourselves together and show people the true challenges are not from within us, right? The true challenges lie elsewhere. So I was going to ask you a little bit more, since you mentioned it, Raven. In 2016, Lummi Nation successfully prevented the construction of a large coal export terminal in Washington. And you mentioned that this could have lined a lot of people's wallets with, a lot of money. What did that mobilization look like? And how did people get on board, especially when money is dangled as an incentive?
Yeah, I mean, as you imagine, there were people in Lummi who wanted to take the deal, and valid, I don't discredit or invalidate what that is, but I was also very young at the time, 13. In 2013, we went and fished on Quechiacan. We fished our traditional reef net, the Xwala, and we fished in our traditional Xwala territory, which is a Xwesultun, that's a reef net site. Xwesultun is a willow tree. Xwesultun is a reef net site. And reef net sites have been passed down historically in the same families for generations, for 10, 20,000 years, since time immemorial, we say, because the reef net was given to us as a gift from the Creator. And therefore, we cannot own the reef net. It can only be handed down in family, but you can own the site, and that's why the families handed down the sites. But the building and construction of the reef net was always in family. That is to say, when you speak to farmers and they talk about being fifth-generation farmers or second-generation farmers here in the States, and that's why their patrimony is assigned to the farmlands, here in we're 100th, 200th generation fishermen that have been fishing these territories and waters. And so when you get this proposed site and it has this idea of value that it's going to provide to us, we have to compare it with our other value systems. And it didn't win. The billions of dollars did not win over our value system, our valued relationship with this territory. We have hundreds of reef net sites. This is only one. People would think, God, you can't even. Well, the consequence of us saying yes to this coal terminal is that we're selling out the entire Salish Sea. I don't think people realize what the damage of that would have done. It would have wiped out everything. And that would have been the other side of the coin, all for Lummi's benefit. How would that have been fair, right? In 2013, we went out and I got to participate as a youth at the time and fished our reef net on Quechiacan. And 3 years later, when they rejected it, they marked that was one of the reasons that they overturned it, was because it infringed on our treaty rights. It wasn't that it was an ancestral burial ground. It wasn't the fact that we had village sites there. It was our fishing rights, our treaty rights that protected that. But it involved us taking a sacrifice. Because if we put our treaty right on the line there and we lose, it sets precedents for corporations all over that their movements are more powerful than the secured rights and the laws of the land. In my current research that I'm doing, it's for the Wayne Suttles book. We have the dissertation from Wayne Suttles' 1952 a PhD thesis from UW, and he was a man of his times, just like the elders were that he was speaking to, and they all were kind of in unity, thinking the culture was going to die. There was no way forward for it. And they wrote from that perspective, and that's okay. I'm not bringing down, I believe that even my work will be judged, and that's the beauty of science, is it's always going to be improved upon and expanded upon. We get the opportunity to expand on Wayne Suttles' work and show we are still here. We are resilient, we are strong, we are sovereign, and our culture is alive, not just in our elders, it's alive in our youth. And in the very process of Nick Claxton up here in Canada fishing to fish in common in his chapter 4, when he brings the youth out and he's fishing and they're challenging 100-year-old legislation because they fished a reef net in the Xwala for the first time in Canada in over 100 years. And then we fished on Quechiacan and Cherry Point. And what does it provide? It's this traditional technology. A woman, the reef net, the Xwala, is a woman in our culture that provides. And she continues to provide for us today by even without catching salmon. She's provided environmental protection. She's provided cultural healing and ceremony and passing on to the youth. And what's influenced my work and where I'm at, that's some of the earliest work I got into this. And even though I was a youth at the time and I didn't know what I was really getting into, as I reflect back and the years go on, I grow more and more value for this experience that I was just thrown into. And so I don't know if I answered the question, but
answered it perfectly. Yeah. And I think you just showed, how these things in action inspire others. Yeah, to uphold those values and uphold those practices that have made us resilient for thousands of years. Thank you for that. And I was thinking, as you're talking, May and Skip Sam, Nick Claxton, Troy and Shirley out your way, it's happening. There's a reef net resurgence, and that's it's super exciting for me to just kind of witness, but also to see the impact it's having on future generations. So, what for that? Last question, and you've answered it in different ways, but I'll just put it in a kind of point blank. It's kind of a large question. What does Indigenous liberation, freedom look like for you, for both of you?
It looks like coming back into our relationships. Yeah. Starting inside. Just being together. Remembering who we are. And then staying true to that. It takes a deep trust in our way of life. It's when we start to fear that, our way of life isn't going to be able to exist, that we make choices that take us out of it. And I feel like, for me, to be fully alive means to be being in these relationships. And there's parts of me, because I am also the land, like all of these are ancestral relationships. They've made me who I am, and I've also made them who they are. So we have to be in connection with each other to liberate ourselves. And we're all in it together. It's not a self-only thing.
Yeah, it can't occur in isolation. We have to come together in some way. Yeah, what for that? Raven?
Yeah, I think of I think dichotomies are some of the worst things because they tear us apart, and the terms of liberals and conservatives are understood politically different than liberation and conservation. And I think liberation and conservation are both important aspects in life, and that's the way they should be accepted in politics as well, rather than drawing people to one side or the other. So what is liberation, and how is it different from the term conservation? And if we're taking it out of the colonial lens of liberation and conservation, how do we understand them in an Indigenous sense, What parts do we have to liberate to be allowed to be Indigenous? What parts do we have to conserve as Indigenous people from our traditional ways of life to bring in, and what to share and what not to share? And so that's kind of for us to figure out as Indigenous communities. But as an overarching community, liberation is us all remembering that we're on the same team, whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. I call it the good work, and some of us are not moving in that direction to make this, to shift the world in this good work and that culture. What that means, we don't know what it is, but we know where we're going, and we know that in these small steps of doing the good work, that it's going to have this overall direction. And maybe it's not one destination, but multiple. But it is a liberation from this contemporary colonial culture that I would argue is capitalistic. It's birthed from industry. It's made its way through exploitation. You get these. That's what we're liberating from, and what are we liberating around us? The things, not just the lands, the animals, the salmon. We're liberating our own relationships because they have been cuffed and they have been thrown in the closet, and the key has been hidden. And so liberal and conservative, liberals, conservatives, different approach in liberation and conservation, and we need to keep that true. Indigenous liberation will look like all of us working as a team to return these natural Indigenous beings back to the place and beings that they need to be. It's land back isn't land back for Indigenous people solely. It's also land back for all Indigenous beings on the land, water, air. So, yeah.
Thank you, Wado, for such great words and for sharing this time with us today. So thank you both.
Thank you for having us.
Exit new.